Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. On Poppy is spelled Poppie. Got to remember that because people get confused. You got a few different Poppies. I've never seen a Poppy last name spelled Poppy, but I've seen Poppe and I've seen Poppie. I think I've seen Poppi as well. I'm not related to them, by the way. On my site, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. It is boil it down to its most basic genre. It is an adventure story, so check that out. If you like The Wheel of Time, you'll probably like that. Or you can check out, what am I trying to say? You can check out my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet, which is a revenge crime thriller. So check that out as well. You can check out One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet for free on my site. So why not, because it's free. And then you can see if you like something that I'm putting out that doesn't get as much care as my my book, you can check that out. And if you even like it a little bit, the book it's more of a matter of time. So sorry about that. So I'm a little sick, so if I sniffle, I'm really sorry, and I'll try not to. But it's inevitable that it's going to happen. But the One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet was a challenge. I like to try to give myself creative challenges, and One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet was one of those. And I was like, well, I want to write this. I want to write one every single month, and I've been doing that. But if you write one every single month, how I work is I can't bring it up to the same level that I am able to write for a book, because a book has I don't know how many times I went over my book when I was writing it, but it was a lot. And as I went over it, I got to the point where I was just sick of even reading it. I don't enjoy reading the book because I went over it so much. It's kind of like playing a song too much. But with One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet, I have to get it out so quickly, so I don't have as much time to go through it, just because of other stuff going on. So if you like it, then you might like my other stuff as well. But it's kind of a test, It's more of like, it's closer to a first draft than anything of my work. So, yeah. Guess we'll move along. I think that's all. Word of the week is prosaic. Word of the week is prosaic. Word of the week is prosaic. And prosaic means run-of-the-mill, dull and plain, or banal, or matter of fact. I just found out that you can say banal two different ways. Some people say it banal, so banal, and some people say it banal. And I think both are correct. I think I've heard banal more often, but Google is telling me I'm wrong. But what does Google know? Come on, people. What does Google know? So we're gonna jump into our accidental essence today, and we're gonna be talking about artists who change the game itself. This happens in pretty much everything, and it's not necessarily a good thing in all things. I would say that if you are working with in art or in an economy or something like that, if you're working on something that you're a carpenter, you can do this. It's those areas. But if you're it happens in a lot of different areas. I think it happens with ideas as well. I haven't written books on this or anything like that, but you can definitely see ideas shifting in different ways, and sometimes the ideas shifting are because of specific people making specific efforts to push those ideas forward. So you're doing it politically more. It's typically in a more political manner, and what I mean by that is you have a long game. So when someone pushes ideas forward and they're doing it more as a group, they're like, hey, how can we get these ideas out into the world, and how can we have people start accepting these ideas? Your politicians, if they are... So some people don't like politicians. I get that. I don't think there's much reason to like them as a group. But some people don't like politicians, and but if you are someone, you have certain ideas that you want to be present. So if you have ideas about the world, and you're like, I think the best world is like this, right? If I think that people should live their lives like this, I'm not saying that you should dictate everything everybody does. I actually am against that. I don't think see, I'm set because I'm against dictating what other people do. I apply this rule to myself, and it allows people to do what they want with their lives without interfering with other people, if that makes sense. But if you're someone who has specific ideas, you're like, man, like, if we allow this to happen to the world, this is going to be harmful, and if we allow this to happen to the world, this is going to be beneficial. And if you do it in that way, it's a more political way. But if you have an idea and you think the world should go that way, and it's almost a necessity that it functions in that way, you are going to support politicians. And if they are good politicians, they have long-term plans to make those things happen, right? It's often, and the weird thing about my position is that you should let people do what they want, right? That you have this freedom to do what you want. That people have the freedom to do what they want, and they should choose to do good for themselves and for those around them. Like, there's certain things I think are bad that people should be allowed to do. When I bring that up, when I talk about it in that way, it seems to be the case. People fall back to this idea that they shouldn't push that out into the world, and I'm saying that if your politicians are good politicians, they should. But yeah, so in every area, in a lot of different areas, there are people who change how things function, and that's what we're talking about. And I think that when you look into this, I think that it's a lot more interesting to see. Okay, maybe it's not more interesting. It's oftentimes more interesting to see an individual person who does something different that switches how people do things. When Isaac Newton was suddenly like, hey, here's a theory of gravity, or here's my 5 laws, right? Isaac Newton's like, here's my 5 laws, and here's my theory of physics. Here's how I think physics works. Newtonian physics. Well, people were like maybe they were using something similar, but he kind of cemented that in until around Einstein, who was another person who said, hey, I think this actually works in a different way. And it shifted how people thought about things in a generation, right? Which is really, really cool. And it often happens in a generation. Things can happen. It takes longer than a year typically. And I'm not beyond saying that there can be unbelievably quick shifts in a year. I think that if you're going to do a shift in culture such as art, music, etc., I think that 10 years is pretty good. That's why we have all these different, you listen to the 90s, you listen to the 80s, 70s, 60s. These are all different eras, and they all have specific sounds and different ideas going through them. There's a lot of music that is related to being a hippie from the 60s, and there's a lot of music that sounds like it's still from the 50s, right? The Beatles, their early stuff was it was stepping forward from the 50s, but it still kind of sounded more like the 50s than their later stuff, in my opinion. But yeah, so you have these different decades, and typically it's the case that if you're dealing with something smaller such as art, you are going to have things change you're going to have things change more quickly. And if you're dealing with something bigger, such as, I would say, something that, okay, so with art, the reason why art can change so quickly is because it works with truth in a different way, right? It doesn't have these statements about truth. Once you bring these ideas and you say this is what is true and this is what isn't true, then you start to deal with things that change more slowly. That is why religions try to hold on to their doctrine, because religions say, hey, this is the most true thing that exists in our existence. This is the most true thing that exists in the world, so we want to hang on to that true thing. This is why if you're in a Western country, you see that there's still Christian churches around, but a lot of them have taken on ideas that are in line with the culture around them. Almost all of them have taken on a lot of ideas in line with the culture around them, because first century Christians were not thinking in the same way as 21st century Christians. But yeah, they take on ideas of people around them. Now there are some that don't, right? There are some groups that don't take on the ideas of the present culture around them, but they still have taken on ideas or ways they function of the culture. So there's the Amish that they still, do you know the Amish? Some Amish have cell phones, and then they'll have a shed. So if you get Amish furniture, here you go. this is probably how it works. So the Amish can't have electricity in their houses and some other things, but they can have a cell phone, and some of them can have a cell phone for whatever sect they're a part of, right? And some of them have sheds with power tools. So if you are getting Amish made furniture, it might be the case you're not getting it built with. Okay, so this is how they get around having power tools in the sheds. Oftentimes they have a generator. Generators produce electricity, but it's not coming through power lines. So that's how they get around it. So if you're someone buying Amish-made furniture, you're getting furniture that is probably hand-built, right? Somebody's going through the process of building each part, but it's still getting built as if you bought it from someone who just made their own furniture. It's the same process. They're not using these. They're using power tools. They're not using like these hand saws and different things like that. But yes, religions shift too, but there's certain things in religions that don't shift. This is why religions will be less likely to say, hey, this is okay or that's okay. It's dealing with moral authority. Generally, it's dealing with morality. And in most cases, in some cases, it goes into different areas as well. But that's why that's going to be moving the least, because it's dealing with truth the most. Now, there are definitely areas that are dealing with truth that can move, okay? And it can move significantly. I think science is an unbelievably good thing, right? I think it's a very good thing. One thing that I think is bad about it is people take for granted the ideas that cannot be proven by science. There's this idea that swept through Western culture, definitely the United States as well, where people thought, hey, science has all the answers to our questions, and anything we ask can be answered by science. Well, you can't, we can prove or disprove something. Well, one thing you can't disprove or prove is whether science is actually works, right? Let me rephrase that. So people are saying, so you can't say science is good. Sorry, I'm a little tired. One thing you can't actually prove or disprove are the basic ideas of science, right? You can't test whether doing a experiment is good or not. You can say, well, we have practical value, but there are certain things that might bring about practical value that aren't good things. We can go back only about 75 years and we see things like that. If you know anything about the Nazi scientists, they did experiments on people, and they were quite far ahead. I think that when there are a lot of there were like 1,400 Nazi scientists brought over to the U.S., I think, but they were further ahead than people in the U.S. And there were people in the U.S. saying they're like 20 years ahead of us in some of this stuff. And now in some cases they're just dealing with aeronautics, right? That's not dealing with people at all. But in some cases they were dealing with whether, like, when people were freezing to death and how to save people when they're freezing to death, or high pressure, because these are all things related to flying an airplane. And they did evil things to people, and they got information that was better than other people's, but it isn't a good thing. And science can't even answer. Science can't say, hey, this is a morally good or morally bad thing. It doesn't have the power to do that. So, and you can do evil thing if you're just basing it off of, what's the effect we see in the world. Now, first of all, you have to say what is good and what is bad, which you can't do. And then second of all, what you might run into is somebody might say, and you can't say that, you can't disprove that they're wrong in this. Somebody might say that someone might say that the needs of the majority outweigh the needs of the few. And if you know anything about U.S. history, well, the needs of you could say the needs of the majority. So the majority of people living in the U.S. were white, and then there was a underclass of slaves that was in the U.S. that were black. So they were a minority. So you could say, well, the needs of the majority outweighed the needs of the few, and as long as that majority is doing well, then we're okay. So it goes beyond it. So I think that, like I said, I think it's a very, very good thing. I think there's unbelievably good things coming from it. I think studying different areas of nature and people, everything is really good, and trying to find how it actually works is good. The issue is that I think people take for granted their assumptions in science, and in science things can change as well. So you can have paradigm shifts in science, and you can shift how people think about something. And I think that takes more of a generation to do. Okay, I think it takes more of a generation. And like I said, you could start telling a whole generation of kids, if you had the ability to do it, you could start telling them one idea that's related to science, right? You could have one specific idea and be like, well, this is the idea we want everybody believing. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be related to science necessarily. Well, it would eventually, because almost everything is. But when you look at Nazi Germany, what they told people, specific people, were they were lesser people. They weren't really human. So they kept on telling one generation that, they just kept on pumping that out. And there were specific groups, large groups of people in Germany who believed that, like at the very least they acted as if they believed that, which I think is pretty good proof that they believed it. So there can be shifts. Now, I think with that is that you have to be careful about what idea. You have to look at your ideas that cannot be proven or disproven by science, and you have to see whether your ideas are good or bad. And you have to make a judgment on that. And some people base what they do off religion, right? Or you might want to try to go with some type of golden rule, right? But at the same time, you still have to figure out, okay, is this going to result in a bad outcome, or is this going to result in a good outcome? If you were a hardcore Nazi, you could still abide by the golden rule according to what the Nazis thought, right? Because the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and then if you're a Nazi, you could say, well, do unto other people as I would have them to do unto me. But these aren't people, right? That's what they would say. So they would try to flip that on its head. You can flip most anything on its head, though. So yeah, we have shifts in these different areas, and I don't know. There's just like it happens everywhere. Just think of these different phases in these different, what would I call it, eras of the world. Okay, when you introduce the combustion engine to the world, you changed the world. Now, it didn't change immediately, and things don't change immediately in most cases. In our extremely connected world, things change a lot faster. Memes get around a lot faster. When you hear memes, you probably think of pictures on the internet, but memes are more. And if I'm mistaking this or misunderstanding it, you can explain it to me. Memes are specific ideas, and one unique feature of them is that they can be put into specific areas. So they are if you take the original memes on the internet, they are, I think, the epitome of what is going on with the phenomenon, is where you have a picture and you can fit it to what you need, right? So you had text on the top, text on the bottom, and then it had a joke essentially. These are jokes conveyed in memes. So you had the text on the top, text on the bottom, but you have that framework, and that's what I'm trying to say. You use a framework that you're trying to convey things through, and almost all ideas, I think, you could probably boil down to a meme. But yeah, we have different shifts. The introduction of the combustion engine. In the same vein, we have the introduction of the internet, right? It didn't take on right away, but once the 90s started coming along, then eventually the internet it exploded, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be talking to you if it weren't for the internet. Introduced the home computer. Thanks, Apple. Introduced the iPhone. Also, thank you, Steve Jobs. I'm not going to say thank you, Apple, generally. Thank you, Steve Jobs. And those things switched. Imagine, can you imagine life without, some of you can, because you're 1,000 years old, not to insult you, but to insult you. Can you imagine the world without a computer at home? And I mean, there were a big chunk of my life where we didn't have a computer at home, actually. So I liked it. It was good. But at the same time, it's a very useful tool. And now I have a laptop at home, but I don't have a desktop, which has changed. Or can you think of not having a smartphone, right? Once the iPhone was introduced, smartphones were the way to go, and it just made sense. These changed the name. These changed the ways that the world works. And again, along with that, if we introduce faster than light travel, if that's somehow possible, I wouldn't put it past. We think we know something until we realize we don't actually know it. So it could be the case that we misunderstand physics. It could be the case that there's something we don't understand. It's just with faster than light travel, because there's this idea that if the closer you get to the speed of light, your mass increases. So if you get to the speed of light, you have like infinite mass. I'm not a physicist, so if you are, you're really into physics. I'm probably butchering this, and I apologize ahead of time. But your mass is essentially becomes too much. You have too much mass when you're approaching the speed of light. Another thing that would shift how we function as a society is cold fusion, right? Cold fusion is this idea is where you can have a safe nuclear reactor that you could set on like a tabletop. Isaac Asimov, if you've read his Foundation series, they have this idea. I don't know if he specifically thought of it as cold fusion, but essentially they are pressed for space. They don't have enough space, so instead of building things bigger, they have to learn how to build things smaller, and they end up building very small fusion reactors, and they take over the galaxy because they're capable of building these tiny fusion reactors, and they're capable of surviving in a way that other people can't. There's a bit more complexity to that, but I think that like a business takes over the galaxy. Big shifts, like I said, happen in art as well, and it's easier to see this in music than any other art form. Definitely, I think this is, and I think that one of the reasons why it's easier to see in music is because it's easier to consume music, and music is a lot more. All art forms are social, right? All art forms are social, but music, it takes on a different social aspect. I don't read a book with my friends. Does that make sense? But I will listen to music with my friends. You don't go to an author's. You don't go and read. People don't get around. When you go to a party, people don't open books and read them. When you go to a party, people almost certainly play music. So there's a connection there. It goes out into the world. TV can be like this too, but I think music has been around. Music as a phenomenon has been around longer, and I think it's cheaper. So I think it happens more often. So you look at things like the Elvis Presley in the 1950s and 60s, and he kind of introduced rock and roll to the world. You had Jimi Hendrix in the 1960s with the electric guitar and using it in a way nobody had thought about before. The Beatles, I would say that their later music actually was a bigger phenomenon, and they had a bigger cultural shift with their later music and their later ideas than they did with their earlier stuff. And I would say that that's representational of them pretty well. Their later stuff is better. Like I said before, their older stuff is more like the 1950s. It's very much in that vein. Their later stuff, they started to experiment, and I think they did have an impact on. Music, right? And they did have an impact on this idea that you're allowed to experiment with music. You don't have to be so rigid and different things like that. And they tried different things, and they tried to mix things differently. I'm not a musician, and a musician would definitely be able to explain it a lot better than I would. You had the Sex Pistols, and they kind of like brought in this era of punk, which was, I don't know if it was a response to the Beatles, but I kind of see them as two sides of this musical coin. The Beatles, when they were getting big, they were like this. They were more of this this group they were unbelievably huge, and they were liked by a lot of different people. You have that very famous video of the girls who are going wild, like becoming hysteric because the Beatles are getting on the stage. And the Sex Pistols and punk was this push away from being cool in the same way, right? They wanted to be cool in their circles because most people do. But it was this push away from the establishment and the established way of doing things. And I would say the Beatles are on one side of that where it's hippy-dippy, and then punk is on the other side where it's this rough way of doing things. It's more underclass, it's more lower class. Punk is, which I I connect to that a bit. I understand what they're trying to do, and I appreciate it. And I mean, you go on, you have Michael Jackson in the '80s with pop music, and no matter if you like Michael Jackson or not, he did something different with pop music. I don't know. He is his own person. He's his own musician, and there are definitely people who are probably trying to copy Michael Jackson. But are there people during that time period doing something or doing things that were as good as his and as unique? Now, again, I say you can dislike Michael Jackson. You can say, oh, like, you can dislike Michael Jackson, and I'm not the biggest fan of him, but you can still realize he was doing something well. And then you move on to the 1990s, and you have people like Kurt Cobain and with the grunge movement and stuff like that. With all of these that we've seen so far, with all of these, I did say something about if you get signed by a major music production company, you are going to have a bigger influence than somebody who isn't, and you may shift the musical culture just because you were signed by that big production company. There's quite a bit of luck involved, so you were in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. Realize you have to be doing the right thing if that's ever going to happen to you. There's very few people who just stumble into success like unbelievably for you. There's probably less. I don't know if there's less than 100, but most people have to be doing something, and it might be easier for some people than others, but most people do have to be doing something. But they did have the backing of big musical production companies, or big enough to get the stuff out. But at the same time, they were doing things different. And I don't include every single artist. I don't include every single musician that existed. This is a pretty small list because I think that these musicians actually did something different. In the present day, I actually found two musicians who I think are doing things different. I don't know if their effect is going to be huge, but I don't think they are just making something to make something. I think they're actually making something that is unique and has value to it. And you might disagree with me. One of them is Jack White. He did stuff in the early 2000s. He's still doing stuff now. He was never the biggest musician in the early 2000s. He was big. He definitely is big, but he wasn't like the biggest. Not everybody would know his name, but he always does stuff that's different. And it might be the case that he just fades out of memory after he dies, and he doesn't become, and he's not this person who made an impact that's huge and that lasts. It might be the case that happens, but he is doing something different. The other person that I found recently that I think is going to have an impact, I think is almost certainly the case, she's going to have an impact on the future of music, is Billie Eilish, actually. You might hate her, but she is doing something different. It's not rock as is traditionally seen. It has a lot of computer generated beats, I believe, like on a soundboard that you would use. But it's not the same as the one-hit wonder that was Owl City, which I would say is more of a one-hit wonder than a phenomenon. She is more of a phenomenon, I would say, because her stuff is the Owl City stuff. There was that one song that got really big, and it was everywhere. But at the same time, that's what he was doing was more. It was safer. It was doing something that a lot of people were doing something similar. It was very light. It was in that indie era. That indie era had been going on for quite some time. By the time the guy rolled around who does Owl City, but Billie Eilish, there's definitely people doing things different. I mean, similar to what she's doing, but she takes it in a way that's a bit different. So I don't know if Jack White's going to have this huge impact on music going forward. I don't think he will. But Billie Eilish, because she has that unique flavor to what she does, and because she has that production company backing her, the huge production company backing her, she's going to be all right. She's probably going to do something, and she's probably going to shift how people view music. There's a lot of people who are in Gen Z who love her. A lot of girls. Honestly, it's better than boy bands. I prefer her to a lot of stuff that has been out there. She's not bad at all. But all these people looked at things differently, and I think that's the important thing. Elvis Presley took more African American music, and he changed it a little bit. It was a faster. There was more of a push forward with it, but it was more of a show, definitely, when you look at him. And I don't know much about Elvis Presley, but Jimi Hendrix, when he played the guitar, you can tell by how he played that he wasn't just playing the notes. He was thinking, what can I do with this thing? Right? He did a lot of stuff with foot pedals, I believe, and he's like, hey, I've got this foot pedal that changes the sound. Why don't we try something different? And that's what he was asking. He was looking at this. He was trying things different, and he's one of the most famous guitarists of the last 100 years, definitely. The Beatles definitely did different things. Their older stuff, I would say, isn't very different, but their newer stuff is just, yeah, they try new things, and I will give it to them. I'm not a big fan of the Beatles. I think they're overrated. I think most people who are most artists who have big production companies backing them are overrated. But yeah, I'll give them the credit where credit is due. They did experiment. They did go out on a limb. I mean, when you have a huge fan base, it's not that big of a limb to go out on, but yeah. And if you're someone who's a big Beatles fan and you're like, well, they did experimental stuff in the 60s, I'm sorry, I'm not this unbelievably huge Beatles fan, but I do know they did stuff like that was experimental. Sex Pistols and the punk movement in general. Punk didn't last very long. I would say that punk is dead, because it really was a 70s and 80s phenomenon. Maybe there's something that's going to come up. Maybe there's going to be a genre, I really doubt it though, that is going to come up and exist that's really similar to punk. But it started in England, right? It started in Britain maybe in general. It started among lower class boys, right, guys, and it's very much, you can just tell it's this lower class type music. I don't think the Sex Pistols were good at their instruments at all. They were just doing something. And then the other ones too. I mean, it's not that every punk band wasn't able to play their instruments. There's punk bands that make some pretty catchy tunes, but it's this rebelliousness. This is going against the flow. It's trying to break out of the mold that's been set for you. It's saying screw you to the people who are in power, which there's a need for that. And it goes on with these other ones. And that's what these present day musicians are doing as well. They're just trying to look at things differently. They're slowing down. They're approaching their art form not as just trying to make art, right? How would I say this? If I write a book, I can plan it out and I can just write it. I can make it work according to what the general wisdom is of how books are supposed to work. Right? I can definitely do that. I can make a book work according to that general wisdom. And I can probably, I can pick up on what other people are doing. I can say, hey, I like that, I like this, I'll incorporate it into how I write, and I have this big list of what makes good writing, right? And the point of this is that there's always a list of what makes good whatever. There's something called music theory, and this shows you it shows you how music works and what has been done in music. And according to my friend who has a degree in music, he says that music has essentially been dredged. The 12 tones of music have been dredged to their depths. And they've been dredged to their depths since like the Beethoven and Mozart and Bach, those guys, those really big classic composers. But the rules of writing, so if you look at something and somebody's like, well, these are the rules of storytelling, these are the rules of writing, it's like, yes, but no, okay? With writing, and I harp on this a bit, it's always changing because the language is always changing. With storytelling, there's basic things that are going to remain the same, but you're always trying to find a different angle. You're always trying to find something different to do. You're always trying to find a way to look at things differently. If you need to hang upside down and look at something to get a better perspective on it, hang upside down and look at it in that way, if that's going to help you. And that's what's happening with these musicians. They're like, this is how people do things. This is how they've done it before. And they look at it and they're like, I want to do it differently. And they go out on a limb and they do it. You can definitely be safe. Pick a genre. Copy what other people are doing, be safe. Or you can be like, I think this is going to work. I think there's something to what I'm doing. that takes a lot of courage. It takes the ability to. Now, some people will say that, and in the end, it isn't actually the case, right? Some people are like, yeah, I think something is happening here. What I'm doing, I think it's special, and I think it's going to be really good. It might not be the case because they're bad at assessing what they're doing. It might, but if you are someone who's like, I thought about this a lot, and I'm pretty sure that what I'm doing is something that's really good and is something different, and it's something valuable, and I think that's what I'm going for here. You're looking at things differently. You're willing to take a step out. It might be the case that you change the industry. It's really doubtful with writing, just because of how writing and publishing works. But you never know. The kid who wrote Aragon was not a great writer. I don't know. I didn't read the whole series, but that first book, I can't get through it. It's just the writing gets in the way so much. And he was very young, and I'm not trying to pick on him or anything. But that book shifted people's ideas on self-publishing, right? That was at the beginning of when that was happening, and it shifted people's ideas, and now people are doing it a lot more than they were before, unbelievably more than they were before. It wasn't a great book. There's a lot of things that aren't necessarily the best that can shift things. That's how it works. That's how life is. There's some luck mixed into there's some luck in the batter, right? That's mixed in, and that's how it is. But you've got to be in the right place at the right time, in the right situation. But you've actually got to do something to get there. And in this case, if you're doing it and it actually has a high value, I'd say in writing and in creativity, there's a high risk, high reward situation where, hey, I could be okay and I'd be fine just writing it in a way that everybody knows. I'll go to an agent. The agent will read what I've written. They'll be like, yeah, this is really good because I've seen it before and I know it'll work. You could do that, or you could try something that's different. You need a certain level of skill to try something that's different, and I think that's the final thing, because I don't like people wasting their time. I don't like wasting my own time. Always be really really critical of what you're doing. Write that first draft, but be really, really critical when you go back to it and be like, hey, is this worthwhile? I'm not saying that you should give up. I'm just saying that when you approach that editing process, that's when you're brutal on yourself. And it can be really rough, and it's grueling. It's a marathon. It's hard. It's tough. And that's how it is. So that's what I got for you this week. Just maybe think about, instead of thinking about just writing a book, think about, hey, what's the best way to do this? How can I actually shift how storytelling is seen or how writing is seen? And that's the whole point. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you, let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website, check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places. All right. So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.